Things really have been changing in the gaming world on what does and doesn't come out of Japan into the West, especially when it comes to sexual fan service. There were some PS Vita games a few years back that never got to grace the West. If you wanted an English version of those games, you had to go to PlayAsia and pay top dollar to import that copy for an English translation. A big example of this is the Moero or Moero games. The first of those games, Chronicle, never came to the West officially, but you could import from PlayAsia to get an English version of the game. And if I'm not mistaken, they still have the PS Vita English version for sale. But thankfully it later came to Steam and now has returned to handheld for less than half the price you'd pay on PlayAsia. Remastered in HD with some new features along the way, here is my review of Moero Chronicle Hyper for the Nintendo Switch. The story of Chronicle takes place in a world where humans live on one side of the world and monster girls live on the other. This story is around Io and his monster girlfriend Lilia. Io can't talk to girls because of perverse thoughts that lie in his head that he desperately tries to expel from his body. But when monster girls start acting abnormal in the world and humans start disappearing, Io is selected as his village representative to go on a quest to Monstopia and solve the problem. Overall, the story of Moero Chronicle is pretty decent. There is a lot of sexual fan service inserted into the story, but when it takes itself seriously, it's actually a pretty decent story about the tension between these two races. The things I don't personally like about the story are the repetition and the translation. When it comes to translation, there are a lot of statements in the game where words are completely missing from the middle of sentences. And there are a lot of them. I found at least a dozen that I can recall off the top of my head as I played through the game. And the repetition comes from the recruitment process. There are over 30 characters in this game that you can recruit into your party, and every time you recruit one of them, Lilia goes through the same "we're trying to save the world for this region" spiel. And she goes into it in actual dialogue for all 30 plus characters, and once I saw it for the 5th or 6th time, I really got tired of it and started skipping all of the recruitment events. When it comes to gameplay, Moero Chronicle Hyper is a first-person dungeon RPG with a lot of dating sim and romance elements thrown into the mix. As you play through the game, you're going to be navigating first-person dungeons, taking part in turn-based battles, and recruiting and getting very close to a bunch of monster girls. First of all, this is Moero Chronicle Hyper, which is an enhanced port of the original game that released on the PlayStation Vita and later on Steam. As such, everything is in HD here. It's got all of the original events and CG artwork, and it's got a few new features in the form of an autopilot mode for navigating dungeons, stat boosting items for increasing all of your character's stats, and a vibration option added to the bump scratch minigame. Progressing through this game has a hub town and dungeons formula to it. Every chapter gives you a new dungeon to explore with the task of reaching the end and taking down its boss. And whenever you leave a dungeon, you return to your hub town where you can customize and interact with all of your characters. This sounds pretty simple, but there's more to it than that. Every dungeon does have a boss that you need to take down to unlock the next chapter, but every dungeon also has at least 3 Monster Girl mini-bosses for you to find and fight, because that's how you recruit new characters into your party and increase your arsenal of Monster Girls. This is also where it starts to feel a little bit different than other dungeon RPGs. When I go into a new dungeon in this game, my task isn't let's go find the boss and unlock the next chapter. My first thought is let's see what new playable characters I can get and recruit into my party this time. And how you recruit them into your party is where the fan service really starts to take the wheel. Your task in every recruitment process, both explained in the story and outside of it, is to purify each abnormal monster girl by attacking and destroying their clothes to disrobe them and rubbing them all over in the bump scratch rubbing minigame. And that is meant as literally as it sounds. When you finish up the boss fight, you have a rubbing minigame where you use the touchscreen to rub and poke and prod all of the different body parts of each monster girl, filling up a gauge before you quote unquote purify them and bring them back to their senses. And considering there's no mist or clouds on any of these minigames, this isn't exactly something you should be playing when other people are around. Do note that this minigame is clearly meant with the touchscreen in mind. You can't do a lot of the gestures with the analog controls you have for docked mode. Every time I try to do it in docked mode, I would just get frustrated, undock the Switch, and do it with the touchscreen anyways. The controls are there for TV players, but really don't work that well. But once you recruit them, that's where a lot of the fun begins with the romance and the dating sim elements. Back at the Hub Town, you can interact with all of the different monster girls in your party, giving them presents, doing the rubbing minigame, and that unlocks a lot of romantic events between the player and those monster girls. Most of the time leading up to a proper dating sim ending where they fall in love with you and you fall in love with them. The great thing about this is the fact that you don't have to replay the entire game to get the maximum intimacy event for more than one monster girl. You can increase all of them to maximum intimacy and see all of their final cutscenes in the same playthrough. Now let's talk about the actual dungeon crawling for a second. It's pretty typical of other dungeon RPGs. It's got some decently large difficulty spikes as you go from dungeon to dungeon, and every single character has their own movesets that they learn as they fight in your party. Though the job system does give you a little bit of variety. Every character has 4 different costumes you can find in the dungeons that lets you change their job and therefore their skill sets. So if you really need a physical attacker but you really want the fairy latte in your party, all you need to do is find her special costume that turns her into a fighter outside of a mage, and you've got your new fighter without sacrificing a favorite character. Now when all this comes together, you do have a pretty decent amount of length to it, especially for the $19.99 price tag. I reached the normal ending of the game after playing for about 20 hours, and about 5 to 8 hours later, I had maxed out a bunch of intimacy events and gotten the true ending. So depending on what you want to do, you're probably going to be spending at least 20 to 25 hours on this $20 game. Now I've already said my piece about the controls of the minigame, so let's go right into presentation, which is mostly pretty good. All of the environments and character models look really nice and polished. The only real blemish I found in the visual presentation is the fact that the text for some of the accessory names looks a bit stretched and distorted when you look at it in the equipment menu. Now when it comes to performance, let's talk about the game crashing. There are a few things here that can make the game crash. Some of these are already being fixed in a day 1 patch, but outside of that, I've also found that the game will crash pretty often when you're going between recruitment phases. For some of the recruitment characters, when I was going between the battle and the rubbing minigame starting, the game would crash on me. Sometimes it would happen after the rubbing minigame was over. Granted, my second attempts were always successful, but it's something to think about, especially if you recruit someone and ponder whether you should keep going in the dungeon or just go back to the inn and save. And now let's get into battery life, which I expected quite a bit of, considering everything in this game is 2D and not 3D. Moero Chronicle Hyper has a battery range of 3 hours and 2 minutes on high settings, up to 4 hours and 25 minutes on low settings. Now in conclusion, Moero Chronicle Hyper comes to the West in a surprising release that adds a lot of convenience and a cheap price that Vita users didn't get back in 2015. Now on the downside, there are some problems with the story controls and occasional crashing, but if you're looking for a dungeon RPG with a ton of characters to recruit and romance and don't mind fan service being thrown in there as well, this is definitely a fun game to get into. Reviews to Go rates Moero Chronicle Hyper for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.